Welcome to the deep dive. We're digging into a really interesting hypothetical today. Picture this. It's April 2025. Malaysia's PM Anwar Ibrahim is the ASEAN chair, and maybe he's meeting with former Thai PM Thaksin Shinawatra.
Okay. What's the scenario?
They're trying to figure out ASEAN's game plan if Donald Trump returns to the presidency and brings back certain trade policies. We've got an analytical report laying this out.
Gotcha. So sort of pre-gaming the potential trade landscape.
Exactly. Our mission here is to unpack what these potential U.S. policies might actually look like, what they could mean for folks cutting through some of the jargon.
Right. And the first thing that jumps out from reports like this is the probable return of that America First mindset, the focus, probably hammering down the U.S. trade deficit.
Which likely means tariffs. Lots of them, potentially.
Yeah, it looks like a multi-layered approach. First, you might see that baseline 10% global tariff make a comeback on everything.
Okay, a flat 10% across the board. But it gets more targeted.
That's where these potential reciprocal tariffs come in. The idea is the tariff rate matches whatever the U.S. thinks the other country is charging them, or it's based on the trade deficit. And the numbers floated are, well, pretty high.
How high are we talking for ASEAN members?
The report we looked at has projections like Vietnam possibly facing 46%, Cambodia 49%, Laos 48%, Myanmar 44%.
Wow, those are huge numbers. What about others?
Thailand maybe 36%, Indonesia 32%, Malaysia 24%, and the Philippines lower at 11%. It varies a lot based on those deficit calculations.
The kind of variation within ASEAN itself, that sounds like a recipe for internal stress, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Especially if, as some suggest, these big reciprocal tariffs initially focus on countries other than China. Suddenly, different ASEAN members face wildly different threats. Unity could be tough.
And it's not just those tariffs. The old Section 232 tariffs, the national security ones.
Likely back. Think 25% on steel, aluminum, maybe autos, and potentially expanding to auto parts, lumber, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, stuff that really matters for supply chains.
Plus the existing Section 301 tariffs on China. Probably stick around.
Yeah, likely remain, maybe even new investigations. And then there's talk of using IECPA, that's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to link tariffs to totally unrelated things, like fentanyl or immigration.
So trade becomes a tool for non-trade goals.
Yeah.
And what about that $800 duty-free limit for imports, the de minimis rule?
That could be gone or heavily restricted, especially for goods from China. That impacts anyone buying low-value items online directly. Big shift.
It paints a picture of, well, a lot of uncertainty. Tariffs changing quickly, linked to all sorts of issues, focused very much on bilateral balances.
Which really puts the spotlight on the U.S.-ASEAN economic relationship. It's massive, nearly $500 billion in goods trade projected soon.
And ASEAN runs a pretty big trade surplus with the U.S., right?
Yeah.
Around $227 billion.
They do. The U.S. is also the biggest source of foreign investment in ASEAN. So there's this deep connection. Jobs on both sides depend on it. High-tech electronics, semiconductors, textiles, key exports for ASEAN.
But that surplus makes ASEAN a target under an America First lens.
Exactly. Which brings us back to that hypothetical meeting. How might Anwar Ibrahim approach this? His style emphasizes ASEAN centrality, multilateralism, sticking to the rules.
So he'd see these tariffs as undermining the WTO, that kind of thing. He actually publicly pushed back on the calculation from Malaysia already, didn't he?
He did. His approach seems to be calm but firm, focus on national interest, but explicitly rule out retaliatory tariffs. He'd likely push for ASEAN unity, using existing agreements like RCEP and CPTPP.
Almost seeing the threat as a way to galvanize ASEAN integration.
Possibly. Now contrast that with Thaksin Shinawatra. His background is Thaxinomics, more populist, state spending, boosting domestic demand, and his foreign policy was always pretty proactive, pushing for bilateral deals.
And more pragmatic, maybe. Transactional.
That's the word often used. He might suggest more flexibility, looking for sector-specific deals, maybe bilateral understandings to minimize the damage. Leverage ASEAN's collective weight, sure, but be ready to cut deals. His FTA experience would be relevant there.
So a potential tension between a principled, unified stance and a more flexible deal-making approach. What are ASEAN's core interests here?
Fundamentally, keeping access to the U.S. market, keeping supply chains stable, attracting investment, and trying to uphold trade principles and ASEAN unity.
And their strengths.
Their collective economic size is significant. They're crucial in key supply chains, especially semiconductors now. They have existing dialogue channels with the U.S.
But the weakness, as we said, is that internal division potential, right? Those wildly different tariff impacts.
That's the core challenge. How do you maintain consensus when Vietnam might face nearly 50% tariffs and the Philippines only 11%? It creates huge incentives to break ranks.
So what tools does ASEAN actually have, assuming retaliation is off the table?
Unified diplomacy is number one. Using those existing frameworks, like the ASEAN-US TIFA, highlighting the shared economic pain these tariffs would cause, including for U.S. businesses.
Okay, making the economic case. What else?
Seeking broad exemptions or suspensions, maybe negotiating specific sectors like semiconductors. They can still refer to rules and principles, even if the U.S. administration seems less interested.
Could they link it to other areas, like security cooperation?
Definitely. Strategic linkages, security, counterterrorism, maritime issues, building coalitions with other U.S. trade partners facing similar threats, lobbying within the U.S. itself, industry groups, Congress, and doubling down on diversifying trade away from over-reliance on the U.S. market.
It sounds like they need a multi-layered strategy.
Absolutely. High-level talks, technical arguments, sector negotiations, lobbying, diversification, all at once.
So wrapping up, what might realistically come out of that hypothetical Anwar-Thaksin meeting?
Probably consensus on needing unity, first and foremost. Agreement on a mixed strategy, diplomacy, lobbying, analysis. Definitely agreement on not retaliating. An emphasis on pragmatism, likely.
And then tasking the ASEAN bodies to work out the details.
Yeah, tasking the Secretariat, ministers to develop action plans, contingency plans for diversification. The main potential disagreement might be how much flexibility to show in negotiations versus sticking rigidly to principles.
It really underscores the tightrope ASEAN might have to walk. Maintaining unity while facing potentially very different pressures, navigating a shifting U.S. approach, it'll be critical for their economies and stability.
It certainly will. Makes you think about how fragile some of these global economic links can be. Yeah.
Definitely. What parts of this whole trade and diplomacy puzzle do you find most compelling right now? And looking ahead, what other global shifts do you think will really reshape economic policies? Lots to mull over there.